A reading from the book of Genesis, chapter 9. Then God said to Noah and to his sons with them, "As for me, I am establishing my covenant with you and your descendants after you, and with every living creature that is with you, the birds, the domestic animals, and every animal of the earth with you, as many as came out of the ark. I establish my covenant with you that never again shall all flesh be cut off by the waters of a flood. And never again shall there be a flood to destroy the earth." God said, "This is the sign of the covenant that I make between me and you and every living creature that is with you for all future generations. I have set my bow in the clouds, and it shall be a sign of the covenant between me and the earth. When I bring clouds over the earth, and the bow is seen in the clouds, I will remember my covenant that is between me and you and every living creature of all flesh. And the waters shall never again become a flood to destroy all flesh. When the bow is in the clouds, I will see it and remember the everlasting covenant between God and every living creature of all flesh that is on the earth." God said to Noah, "This is the sign of the covenant that I have established between me and all flesh that is on the earth." Our text today from Genesis 9 picks up toward the end of the story of Noah and the ark. The floodwaters have receded, all of the bad stuff, God regretting having created humans and deciding to flood the whole earth to get rid of them. All that stuff is over by this part of the story. Now it's all rainbows and unicorns and promises of God's care and protection of every living creature of all flesh on the earth. Earlier in Genesis, the first 2 chapters of Genesis, we read 2 quite different stories of creation back to back. We did that a few weeks ago in our learning community after church. Just as there are 2 distinct stories of creation in Genesis, did you know that there are 2 biblical stories of Noah and the ark? Now, they're not as easy to spot because they're woven together, beginning in Genesis chapter 6. In fact, if it appeals to you to have homework from worship, I have an assignment for you. Open your Bible and read for yourself the flood accounts in Genesis chapter 6 until about chapter 9. Read for yourself evidence of these 2 stories woven together, sometimes with contradictory details. For example, how long did the flood last? 40 days or 150 days? And how many animals were to be taken aboard the ark? Was it 1 pair each or 7 pairs of clean animals and 1 pair of unclean animals? And was it a raven or a dove that Noah released, or was it both? It's confusing. With the 2 stories of creation in Genesis chapter 1 and 2, one follows the other. They're easy to spot. With the great flood story, they're both tangled up together. Both the creation stories and Noah and the ark are evidence that there are various traditions that are woven together throughout the Hebrew Scriptures. We read the Bible, in this case the Hebrew Scriptures, as if it is a unified work from a single author, but of course it isn't. It is comprised of different sources, combined over many centuries by many hands. Now, I don't mean the different books of the Bible are different voices, though of course they are. I mean every book in the Hebrew Scriptures, in this case the Torah, reflects the voices of different traditions that have been all shmushed up together. Now, how many different voices or traditions is somewhat disputed. The most common theory is that there are 4 different voices combined over many centuries by many hands. 4 originally independent documents were combined in the text that we now read. Two of the sources come hundreds of years before the other two. And sometimes the sources, the documents, were combined by listing one story after another, as is the case with the creation stories in Genesis 1 and 2. And sometimes they are woven together with details in one verse followed by conflicting details in the next. And to make it even more complicated, the story of a great flood is a myth that clearly predates the Bible. The flood myth motif, as it is called, is found in numerous cultures and religions. Here are the generally shared components of the flood myth. One, a great flood is usually sent by a deity or by deities that destroys civilization, often in an act of divine retribution. Two, the floodwaters are a means of cleansing humanity in preparation for rebirth. And three, most flood myths also contain a culture hero to represent humankind who endures. In this case, Noah and his family. Some type of flood myth occurs in Hinduism, in Chinese mythology, in Greek, Irish, Norse, and Polynesian mythology. Although the story of Noah in the Hebrew Bible has become the most well-known flood myth, in Western cultures at least, we can clearly trace the influence of earlier narratives from Mesopotamia, earlier narratives that were around before the Genesis accounts. It's just further indication that the Bible as we know it did not drop down out of the sky in its current form. The Hebrew scriptures, as well as most other parts of the Bible, were shared orally for generations before they were ever written down. And oral traditions naturally spring from the stories that were around at the time and the questions that people had. For example, at the conclusion of this fantastical tale of a great flood is the rainbow. A rainbow, to us, is something very real and observable. It is the meteorological phenomenon that is the interaction of water droplets and light, resulting in spectrum of light appearing in the sky. But in a pre-scientific era, our ancestors didn't know where these multicolored arcs came from. They observed them in the sky, but they didn't know why they were there, or what they meant, or who might have sent them. And so a myth arose. They created stories, they created myths in an attempt to explain things they did not understand. Humans have always been meaning-seeking creatures. In Greek mythology, the rainbow is the pathway of Eris, a messenger between the gods and humanity. Indra, the Hindu god of thunder and war, uses the rainbow to shoot arrows of lightning. The rainbow serpent of Australian Aboriginal mythology is the creator of all life, giving fertility through rain. And in Hebrew and Christian mythology, our mythology, the rainbow is given by God as a promise that God will never again send a flood to destroy the earth. There is an aspect in the narrative of this myth, our version of the Great Flood, that has always rankled me. Perhaps it does you as well. And that is, why? Why was it important in our flood myth for God to send a flood to destroy the earth in the first place? Well, let's turn back a few chapters in Genesis for what the myth tells us about motivation. The Lord saw that the wickedness of humankind was great in the earth, and that every inclination of the thoughts of their hearts was only evil continually. And the Lord regretted that he had made humankind on the earth, and it grieved him to his heart. Did you get that? God regretted making humankind on the earth. and therefore decided to destroy it. What does it mean for God to regret? And just a reminder, I'm not speculating about what God feels or has ever felt. I have no idea about such things. I'm talking about, in the narrative of our story, why our ancestors who shaped this myth included God's regret as the motivation for God's actions. If you believe, as I do, that the Bible is written by humans who sought to relate to God and to describe God, then a regretful God makes sense. Regret, after all, is an emotion we understand. Apparently, humans have always understood regret. We've all made mistakes. Some of us even live with regrets that we can't ever quite shake. It's hard to escape the ghosts of coulda, woulda, shoulda. But think about it. A God who regrets turns our image of God upside down. We think of the biblical God to be all-knowing and all-present and never-changing, even though when we read the Bible closely, that's not always the God we find there. Religious scholar Karen Armstrong says, God is growing up in Genesis, and we see it in the story of the Great Flood. God's not so fully formed and developed. He doesn't understand what he's doing. He hasn't issued any instructions, as far as I know, to human beings except go forth and multiply. Noah is righteous, but we haven't actually got a clear code as yet. Then God says, I don't like this. Wham, 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 like a child knocking down a sandcastle. Gradually, God has got to grow up and learn, like the rest of us, how to relate to other people. In Genesis, we find a God who gets angry, who has regret, and who does harsh, sweeping things. It sounds a lot like human beings, doesn't it? God shows up in this story with very human characteristics. And not only as an adult human, but as a petulant teenager or a child. Have you ever seen a child build something and then they don't like it and they just smash it up? What we have in Genesis and in this story is an underdeveloped God. It's God as understood and envisioned by ancient people at the earliest stages of the formation of the Hebrew faith. Genesis gives us a God who is in the process of growing up. The end of this story is a covenant, a rainbow, an acknowledgement. God saying, okay, I'm going to stay in this relationship and work it out. The God of our understanding is always evolving. God keeps growing, if we let God grow, that is. At the core of our understanding is that God seeks to be in relationship with us. In the Christian tradition, relationship takes the form of God with us, the incarnation, symbolized in the very human being, Jesus. And the most core ritual that continues to bind us together, of being in relationship with Jesus, with God, with each other, is the sharing of a simple meal, bread and wine.